Hello and welcome back to the third installment of the three video lecture segments available for Lecture 9 of MACS 110, Introduction to Mass Communication Theory. We've already had two segments of the lecture posted to the Blackboard LMS, and this is the third one available in the same weekly material as the other two. And as I concluded in the second video, I'll ask everyone at this point to move to slide number 9 in the accompanying PowerPoint presentation to this series of videos. Now I'm going to jump to the relevant sections of Chapter 11 to assist with your completion of the TED Talk review assignment. But to introduce that material, I'd actually like to return to the beginning of Chapter 10 that we've been looking at in this week's material, at which it says the world has become the global village that Marshall McLuhan enthused about in the 1960s. And there's a number of reasons why this has happened, but one of the most important, according to the chapter, is that media have become central to how we and almost everyone else around the world learn about everyday culture. It's likely that before you ever attended a football game or went to a bar, television and movies showed you how people acted in these places. Television, for example, according to the text, constantly shows you many different types of people in a wide range of situations, often following Schutz's typifications. And your consumption of media content has helped you form useful expectations and reinforced some problematic stereotypes, as typifications are wont to do. And now the internet and social media have increased the ways you can learn about quite complex forms of everyday culture with new forms of interactivity and a much broader range of choices of media content from which to choose. And while much of the early negative reaction to the internet was quite self-interested, as with all mass society theory, its elites were worried that their monopoly of power in the media industries would be compromised. There are four, and in fact, those fears were perhaps justified. Certainly, we're seeing massive changes to advertising revenues as audiences are fragmented across the internet. But there are four early fears that certainly do appear to have merit beyond the perhaps monetary concerns of the rich and powerful. And these include internet addiction, depression, distraction, and atomization. Now, internet addiction is pretty simply defined by the textbook as spending 40 to 80 hours per week online, with individual sessions lasting as long as up to 20 hours. And it explains that addiction occurs because even in moderate internet use, our brains rewire. That is, they alter physiologically. And this requires us to understand the term neural plasticity, which is the brain's physical adaptation to the sensory stimuli it receives. Americans average 30 hours a week on the internet, with 18 to 29-year-olds amassing more than 40 hours a week, which in and of itself actually meets the definition of internet addiction. And of course, this massive use of the internet, this massive online presence, has some consequences, some interesting ones. Page 343 of the textbook says depressed students, actually, were the most intense web users. Probably a statistic that is relevant to the people watching this video. These depressed students exhibited more peer-to-peer file sharing, heavier emailing and online chatting, more video game play, and the tendency to quickly switch between many websites and other online play, and the tendency and other online resources than did the other students that were in the test. All of these are behaviors that are openly related to depression. And this gives rise to the term Facebook depression, although Facebook is not the only culprit in designing this type of emotional phenomenon. It's a depression that develops when a great deal of time is spent on social media sites, leading to the exhibition in the subject and in the social media user of the classic symptoms of depression. And the textbook in Chapter 11 outlines a couple of other consequences, including what's called FOMO. which it doesn't mean YOLO. FOMO stands for fear of missing out. And it manifests as the inability to disengage from social networking for fear of missing something. And certainly, in younger generations, for example, when I went camping with my family and I wasn't tuned in to cable television and the shows that my peers and friends were watching, I did feel strangely disconnected while I was out in the wild, so to speak. And I think that this FOMO is just a heightened example of the same thing under the conditions of the internet. And the next phenomenon that is pointed out as a consequence of this heightened use of the internet is called atomization. And atomization simply means disconnecting individuals from one another and their communities rather than face to face and social interpersonal interactions. Much of our socialization is occurring through social media. And there's an opportunity on page 344 of the textbook. There's a box called Thinking About Theory, Internet Addiction Self-Analysis. And there's actually quite a few of these online. I had one that I had planned on presenting to the class and doing with them, which of course we can't do through this video medium rather than face-to-face instruction. But I encourage you to go on the internet and ironically go on the internet and do a Google of internet addiction quizzes or self-analyses and see if you find any interesting or self-revelatory results. Now, the chapter continues, chapter 11, to talk about algorithms, which we might not quite understand. The term algorithms is thrown around, as is the term cookie, both of which are, I think, usefully defined by the chapter. Algorithms are understood as sets of data that, when combined, determine what content people see on the internet. It's actually an internal program that's recording your clicks and choices so that ostensibly the purpose is to provide you with pop-ups and advertising material that is consonant with your own choices and demographics. And a cookie is actually it's an identifying code. It's a specific code address added to a computer's hard drive by a visited website, which algorithms can then read when they have access to the hard drive of the computer you're using to access the internet. Now, internet freedom pioneer Eli Pariser, he says that the basic code at the heart of the new internet is pretty simple. The new generation of internet filters looks at anything you seem to like, the actual things that you've done, or the people that you people like you, and it tries to extrapolate. It tries to expand beyond that data to get a larger picture of you as an internet user. And so he calls them prediction engines, constantly creating and refining a theory of who you are and what you'll want. What you'll do and what you'll want next. And together, these engines create a unique universe of information for each of us. What the textbook calls a filter bubble, or what, this is Eli Pariser's term, a filter bubble, which fundamentally alters the way we encounter ideas and information. And I've given the example in class how my Facebook feed seems to be an almost relentless string of anti-Trump. And if I was to use that as my touchstone for common social sentiment, it baffles me as to why there is such a widespread support for this individual in terms of the voting base. But of course, I'm not getting an honest cross-section. I'm not getting a reasonable sample of social sentiment in my Facebook because the algorithms that have been tracking my Facebook use have created a filter bubble which is, unsurprisingly, a little bit anti-Trump. And so, the idea of the filter bubble, it really sort of reflects, it's not exactly the same, but it's similar to the idea of feedback loops that we looked at in a previous chapter, or also the idea of selective exposure. But rather than it being selective exposure chosen by us as audience members of media content with agency, it's sort of an enforced selective exposure. And the textbook defines it as the ecosystem of information created by web algorithms for each individual. And of course, this gives rise to the very topic on page 350 of computer mediated communication. And in order to understand it, it does distinguish between intra-individual communication and interpersonal communication. Now, intra-individual communication is that occurring within the person, her or himself, sometimes referred to as self-talk, or even when we're alone and talking to ourselves as we try to work out a problem in a little more extroverted than introverted way. And it's set in contradistinction to interpersonal communication, which is, of course, communication between two people or small groups of people. And if you remember from our very first lecture, we decided that the definition of communication that was relevant and useful to this course was only interpersonal communication. And isn't it interesting that here towards the end of the course, intra-individual communication re-emerges as significant? And the textbook says, one question at home in the uses and gratification tradition, which we looked at previously, is why do people use social networking sites to interact with others, especially when distance isn't a factor? That is to say, sometimes we're texting each other even within our own household rather than simply going to our sibling or parent's bedroom and knocking on the door. And psychologists Ashwini Nadkarni and Stefan Hoffman offer what they call a dual factor model of Facebook use, which can actually be applied to social networking use in general. They explain Facebook use is primarily motivated by two basic social needs, which you can see listed at the bottom of this PowerPoint slide. And the first is the need to belong, and the second is the need for self-presentation. Now, in terms of self-presentation, and in lesser terms, but still relevant, is the need to belong, they also theorize two other useful terms for us: idealized virtual identity hypothesis and extended real-life hypothesis, which are really opposite in the way they understand how the need to belong and the need for self-representation can manifest socially on social network sites. The idealized virtual identity hypothesis is one that suggests a tendency for creators of social network site profiles to display idealized characteristics that do not reflect their actual personalities. And in fact, I've seen pathological examples of this. You know, the really obvious example is nobody chooses for their profile picture a picture of them looking awful or average. Generally, our profile pictures are images we've chosen that display our actual physical characteristics in a way that we feel confident about. And generally, that is perhaps a little bit more beautifying than what might be evident in our physical presence. It's what I refer to as digital makeup. And I don't think it's any more offensive than the use of things like makeup or cosmetics or the equivalent for gendered male individuals in our society. But of course, it can take on pathological elements. I know some people that use filters not only to create images of themselves for others, but then come to believe in those images as accurate representations of themselves. But this idealized virtual identity hypothesis goes beyond simply the profile picture that we might choose. Memes have become, as we learned from our culture jamming assignment, a very political way of expressing ideologies or even personal philosophies. And one thing I've noticed amongst people that I tend to recognize as suffering from the idealized virtual identity effects are the posting of memes that demonstrate personal philosophies or even ideologies that are actually the exact opposite of what I know they are like in person. And what this suggests to me is that there's an assumption, perhaps unconscious, on these social media site users' parts that posting these memes will create an image of them that people will see that's contradictory to who they really are. It's perhaps a little bit of projected wish fulfillment of personal characteristics. Now, the second way of understanding this use of social media networking, which is in contradistinction to the idealized virtual identity hypothesis, is the extended real-life hypothesis, which is a little less cynical, a little less critical, and perhaps a little more idealistic and even utopian, if not naive. And it suggests that people use social networking sites to communicate their real personality. That is to say that the social networking site might have elements of idealized virtual identities, but that the viewers of them are not fooled, and that it's really no different than what I have called digital makeup. It's just putting your best foot forward, so to speak, and is actually creating social connections that would otherwise not have been available across vast distances of space-time. And so now I'll ask that everyone switch to slide number 10 in the PowerPoint presentation that is accompanying this third and, well, all three of the video lectures for lecture 9 of this week of the course material on the Blackboard LMS under the weekly materials. And because I'd really like now to get a little bit into the nitty-gritty of the assignment of the TED Talk review. Now, at this point in the class, I would have actually taken the time to watch the video by Manoush Zomorodi called How Boredom Can Lead to Your Most Brilliant Ideas. It's a TED Talk, and it is available, also posted to the Blackboard LMS, and the link is there. It's required for the assignment. This might be a good opportunity to take the time to watch that video. And in reference to this video, it's important that you also look at Chapter 11 of the textbook, specifically pages 342 to 4, 346 to 7, and 350 to 353. And I've listed those as part of the assignment on the course outline. And really, after we would have watched the video in class, I really just wanted to emphasize your responsibilities and requirements for completing this assignment. Really, the question is, what is your opinion on some of the ideas presented in this TED Talk and the way in which these ideas are presented? So this is not a research paper. You don't have to actually go beyond any of the readings for the course or beyond watching the video itself. Like I said, it's more like an opinion piece or an editorial that you might write for a newspaper, your opinion or your editorial on the content of the video. Still, you must reference the relevant sections of the textbook. You can use outside sources or two if you want. They're not necessary, but it is necessary that you make use or reference to and integrated reference to these few pages that you can see listed from Chapter 11 on the PowerPoint slide. Now, the evaluation, I will evaluate you on the structure and style of your paper, its originality within the parameters of the assigned topic, how informative and interesting it is, how much effort you appear to have put into writing it, and specifically and most importantly, your ability to integrate course ideas. So these evaluation criteria are listed also under the assignment section of the course outline and on Blackboard. And the assignment should be around 750 words long, typed, double-spaced, with the header data single-spaced on the top left of the first page. This is all demonstrated in the course outline as well. You can write in the first person singular. It is an opinion piece. And however, in marking the assignment, there are a couple of things that are that I will be on the lookout for. Of course, plagiarism will be assigned a mark of 0 if I discover evidence of it. Grammar and syntax and diction will be graded. So if second language interference is a problem for you, or simply those skills in general are a problem for you, I'll encourage you to find external assistance in submitting an appropriate assignment. And it does require proper use of MLA citations. Really, the only thing you have to cite is the textbook, but that will be necessary in order to acquire full grades. Of course, I'm available by email in terms of further questions about this final assignment or any of the assignments that remain outstanding for the course as we juggle into an online-only version of the last few classes before the term ends. So I'll encourage everyone to feel free to contact me if you need information. But please make sure that you have reviewed the material in the course outline, reviewed the material in these videos, and reviewed your own notes before sort of randomly contacting me and asking me to answer questions that are already posted somewhere, so that I can focus my attention on those students that are struggling with content material more directly. Thanks again for taking the time to review these video lectures in lieu of our face-to-face instruction in MACS 110. And on a final note, in these strange times, I will encourage everyone to stay safe and take care of yourself. And I'll look forward to reading the contributions that we have remaining in terms of the evaluation for MACS 110. Next week, I will post once again the perhaps I think last series of brief lecture videos in lieu of face-to-face instruction to the Blackboard LMS. And until that time, have a great week.